I love gardening, but whenever it's time to harvest the vegetables I've grown, my son throws them all away. My name is Margaret Allen. My garden is the only place where I feel truly alive. When I kneel in the dirt, feel the cool soil crumble between my fingers, and watch tiny green shoots push their way into the sunlight, I remember who I am beyond the years, beyond the wrinkles, beyond being just mom or grandma. Gardening isn't just a hobby, it's my anchor. After my husband died, I nearly lost myself in grief. The silence of the house pressed in on me, and I thought I'd drown in it. But then I found a packet of old seeds tucked away in the pantry. Lettuce, tomatoes, green beans. They weren't much, but they called out to me. I dug a patch in the backyard, planted them, and watched them grow. And with every new leaf, every root, I found a piece of myself healing. It wasn't just vegetables I was raising, it was my hope, my will to keep going. But my son Daniel doesn't see it that way. The first time I caught him throwing away my vegetables, I thought it was a mistake. I had placed a basket of freshly picked cucumbers and tomatoes on the kitchen counter. I was proud of them, the skins glossy, the colors rich like jewels from the earth. When I returned later, the basket was gone. I checked the fridge, the pantry, the counters, even the garage freezer. Nothing. Finally, outside near the trash bin, I found them. My harvest dumped carelessly with coffee grounds and broken eggshells. At first, I thought perhaps one of the cucumbers had spoiled, and he'd thrown them all out in haste. But then it happened again, and again. I asked him once quietly, "Daniel, did you throw away the tomatoes I left on the counter?" He shrugged. "Yeah, they were just in the way." "In the way," I whispered. "They're not worth keeping, Mom. The store stuff is cleaner, looks better, tastes better too." His words sliced through me like a blade. Not worth keeping. That night, I sat on the porch with the empty basket in my lap, staring at the darkened soil in the yard. All those hours under the sun, the sweat dripping down my back, the careful watering, the patience to wait weeks for a single green bean to stretch to its full size, all of it dismissed as worthless. But I told myself he didn't mean it. Maybe he was tired from work, maybe stressed. So I let it go. Still, each season, when the vegetables ripened, the same ritual played out. I'd pick my beans, carrots, zucchini, and set them gently in bowls or baskets. And before I could cook them or share them, they'd vanish, straight into the trash. At first, I cried quietly in my room. Then I stopped crying and just felt a hollowness grow inside me. The garden was my joy, my small claim to purpose, and my son treated it as nothing more than garbage. There were times I tried to hide my harvest slipping carrots into a drawer, tucking zucchini into the crisper slicing tomatoes, and putting them in a sealed jar. But somehow, Daniel always found them. Always threw them out. Once I caught him mid-motion dumping a bowl of fresh green beans into a trash bag. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't even look at me. "Because, Mom, nobody wants to eat this junk. It's embarrassing. Just stop." Embarrassing. That word cut deeper than anything. I didn't say anything else. I just stood there watching the beans disappear into black plastic, feeling like a piece of me was disappearing with them. I wondered if maybe I was the embarrassment. Maybe he didn't want friends to see me in the backyard bent over the dirt like some old-fashioned farm wife. Maybe in his eyes I was as out of place as my vegetables, but I couldn't stop. Gardening is in my blood now. It's the one place where the world makes sense. Seeds sprout, vines stretch, flowers bloom, fruit ripens. There's order, patience, reward. In the garden, effort means something. In this house, my effort means nothing. I used to daydream that one day Daniel might sit at the table, take a bite of one of my roasted tomatoes, and smile. Maybe he'd say, "This is good, Mom. Better than the store." And in that moment, I'd feel seen, valued. But it never came. Instead, each harvest season became a silent battle. Me growing him discarding, me nurturing him rejecting. Sometimes I sit on the porch at dusk, the garden stretching before me, and I whisper, "Why, Daniel? Why can't you just let me have this one thing? Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story." So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. Because one day I decided I wouldn't let him throw me away with my vegetables. It wasn't just once or twice. It became a cruel pattern like clockwork. Every time the garden began to offer its gifts, Daniel found a way to destroy them. The spring peas were the first to suffer. I remember picking them one morning, the pods cool and plump, snapping satisfyingly into my basket. I was excited. Peas don't come easy, not with the soil we have. They need care, protection from insects, and the right watering. That year, I thought I had finally gotten it right. I imagined steaming them, gently sprinkling a little salt, and maybe even sharing some with the neighbors. But when I came back into the kitchen later that afternoon, the basket was empty. The counter was wiped down as though nothing had ever been there. Outside in the trash bin, I found them again, peas, scattered among orange peels like green pearls lost in filth. I stood there for a long time, staring down into the bin. The flies buzzed, the smell rose up, but what stayed with me was the shame. It felt personal, almost deliberate. I wasn't just losing vegetables, I was losing pieces of myself. After that, I began to watch him more closely. And I saw the pattern clearly. Whenever I brought something in from the garden, Daniel would either take it straight to the trash or wait until I left the room. Sometimes he did it in silence, as though it was just routine. Other times, he made a show of it. "Mom, why do you keep bringing this stuff inside?" he said once, holding up a tomato as though it were diseased. "We don't need it." "It's food, Daniel," I whispered. "Good food." "Good." He laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Nobody wants to eat dirt-tasting tomatoes. Just buy them from the store." I wanted to shout to tell him these weren't dirt-tasting, they were alive, full of sun and earth and patience. But the words died in my throat. His tone was too sharp, too final. That summer, I stopped setting my baskets out on the counter. I tried cooking small amounts, quickly hiding the ingredients until they were simmering in a pot or roasting in the oven. For a while, I thought maybe this could work. If he only saw the finished dish, maybe he wouldn't throw it away. But Daniel noticed. He always noticed. One evening, I had roasted zucchini with olive oil and garlic. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and inviting. I set the pan on the table with a quiet pride. Daniel looked at it once, scowled, and pushed the dish aside. "You used your garden stuff again, didn't you?" "Yes," I admitted softly. "Then I'm not eating it." He got up, dumped his plate in the sink, and left the room. I sat there alone, staring at the untouched zucchini. I ate some myself. The flavors warm and comforting, but it felt hollow. Cooking for yourself is survival. Cooking for family is love. When that love is rejected, it leaves a taste more bitter than any vegetable could. Sometimes I wondered if Daniel even realized what he was doing to me. Did he know how much it hurt, or did he just not care? I tried to remind myself he was busy, stressed, always carrying the weight of his job. Maybe in his mind, tossing out vegetables was a small thing, not an insult. But then I remembered the way he looked at me, dismissive, almost mocking, and I knew. He wanted me to stop. Every act of planting, watering, and harvesting became a secret rebellion. When I bent down to pull weeds, I felt like I was protecting something sacred. The earth was on my side, even if my son was not. But no matter how much I tried to shield my joy, he found ways to strip it from me. The cruelest part wasn't the waste. It wasn't even the money lost or the food discarded. It was the message. The unspoken words in every handful of beans tossed into the garbage: "You don't matter. Your effort doesn't matter. You are in the way." I began to dread harvest season. Where I once felt excitement, now I felt tension. Each ripening tomato was a countdown to humiliation. Each basket filled with cucumbers felt like a trigger waiting to be pulled. Still, I couldn't stop planting. The garden had saved me once, and I clung to it. Even when my son tore down the fruits of my labor, the act of nurturing something from seed to life kept me grounded. It was the only proof I had that I could still create beauty. But the more Daniel repeated this pattern, the more something hardened inside me. Quietly, I began to see his actions not just as neglect, but as cruelty. And cruelty cannot go unanswered forever. I told myself, one day, Daniel. One day you will regret this. When Daniel tells me my vegetables are worthless, it cuts deeper than he realizes. He thinks he's just mocking a hobby, dismissing a few tomatoes or beans as nothing. But he doesn't know what those vegetables mean to me. He doesn't know that gardening is the only thing that pulled me out of the darkest hole of my life. After my husband Richard passed away, I felt like the walls of the house were closing in on me. His absence echoed in every room: the empty chair at the table, the silence where his laughter should have been. Nights were the worst. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old house, and wondering what reason I had left to wake up in the morning. Then one day, while clearing out the pantry, I found a little packet of seeds. They must have been years old, tucked away and forgotten. Lettuce, tomatoes, beans. I don't even know why I opened them, but something in me stirred. Maybe it was instinct, maybe desperation. I went into the backyard, grabbed an old trowel, and started digging. The first row I planted was crooked, the soil too dry. But as I pressed each seed into the earth, I felt a strange calm settle over me. My hands were busy, my mind quiet for the first time in months. Day by day, I checked those little plots. At first, nothing. Just dirt. But then tiny green shoots appeared, fragile, yet determined. I remember crouching down, touching the first sprout with my fingertip and whispering, "You're alive." And so am I. That garden became my therapy. Every weed I pulled felt like I was tearing grief out of my chest. Every bud that bloomed felt like a promise that life still had meaning. When the first tomatoes ripened bright and red, I cried as though they were gifts from Richard himself. So when Daniel sneers at my garden, when he tosses away my harvest, he's not just discarding food. He's erasing the only thing that gave me back a reason to live. One evening, after I had set a basket of carrots and beans on the counter, Daniel came home and spotted them. He smirked and said, "Mom, why do you keep wasting your time with this junk? You think anyone actually wants this?" I tried to smile to keep my voice calm. "I like it. It makes me happy." "Happy," he laughed. "What's so happy about dirt and bugs? You're too old for this kind of nonsense. Just stop." Too old. Worthless? Nonsense. His words echoed in my chest long after he left the room. I stood there staring at the basket of vegetables, and for the first time in years, I felt the old grief creeping back in. But instead of crying, something else stirred inside me, a quiet defiance. I whispered to myself, "These are not worthless. I am not worthless." Still, I couldn't shake the shame. That night, I dreamed of Richard sitting on the porch smiling at me as I carried a basket of tomatoes. "Don't let him take this from you, Maggie," he said in the dream. "This is yours." The next morning, I tried again. I roasted some carrots with honey and thyme, filling the kitchen with warmth. I set them on the table, waiting. When Daniel came in, he barely looked at the dish before pushing it away. Again, with the garden stuff, he muttered, "I told you, Mom, nobody wants it." Nobody. That word hurt more than the rest. Nobody wants it. Nobody wants you. I didn't argue. I just sat there, quiet, eating the carrots alone. They tasted sweet, tender proof of my care, but with every bite I felt more invisible. Sometimes, when Daniel wasn't home, I'd sit in the garden for hours, running my hands through the leaves, whispering to the plants as though they were my friends. I'd tell them my fears, my memories of Richard, my loneliness. And in return, they stood tall, green, and strong, listening in silence. I realized then that Daniel would never understand. To him, vegetables were just food, something you buy at the store. To me, they were survival healing dignity. And every time he threw them away, he was telling me that survival didn't matter. Healing didn't matter. I didn't matter. But he was wrong. Because I did matter. My garden mattered. And one day he was going to see it. One day the truth would grow so big he couldn't throw it away. For now, though, I carried the wound quietly. I bore his ridicule in silence, my heart heavy, but my spirit not yet broken. But silence has its limits. Have you ever been in a situation like this? If you were in this situation, would you forgive or take revenge? Comment below to let us know. It wasn't long before other eyes began to notice. I had always tried to keep the ugliness inside the house away from the gaze of the world. But some truths have a way of spilling out like water leaking through the cracks, no matter how tightly you seal them. My neighbor Mrs. Caldwell was one of the first to sense something was wrong. She was a kind woman, a widow like me, who spent her afternoons tending roses along the fence line. Sometimes, while I watered my beans or tied up the tomato vines, we'd chat across the boards that separated our yards. Her roses always bloomed in radiant colors, deep crimson, soft pink, golden yellow, while my vegetables stood tall and green, simple but proud. One late afternoon, I was carrying a basket of fresh cucumbers and lettuce, intending to put them on the kitchen counter. The sun was low, casting everything in that honey-colored glow that makes even the plainest things look beautiful. Mrs. Caldwell leaned on the fence, smiling at me. "You've got quite the harvest there, Maggie. Your cucumbers put mine to shame." Her compliment made me smile, though I felt the ache in my chest, because I knew those cucumbers wouldn't last the night once Daniel saw them. "Thank you," I said softly. "They've done well this year." "Have you been taking them to the market?" she asked. "Or do you just keep them for the house?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, fumbling for an answer. My throat tightened, the words tangled. I couldn't admit that most of them ended up in the trash discarded by my own son. That shame was too heavy to expose. "Oh, just for the house," I murmured, forcing a smile. Mrs. Caldwell tilted her head, her sharp eyes catching the crack in my facade. "Funny, I never smell much cooking coming from your kitchen, and I've never seen you bring any dishes to the church potlucks." "You used to." Her words pierced me. I swallowed, gripping the basket tighter. "I just haven't felt up to it." She studied me for a moment, then said gently, "Maggie, forgive me if I'm prying, but is everything all right?" I looked away, pretending to adjust a vine on the fence. "Of course. Everything's fine." But my voice betrayed me too quick, too brittle. She didn't push, but her eyes lingered with a softness that made me both grateful and ashamed. When she finally went back to her roses, I hurried inside, my face burning. That evening, sure enough, when Daniel came into the kitchen and saw the cucumbers on the counter, his expression soured. Again, he muttered. Without hesitation, he grabbed the basket and headed for the trash. "Daniel, wait," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But he was already outside, already dumping the vegetables into the bin. I stood frozen in the kitchen, the echo of Mrs. Caldwell's question haunting me. "Is everything all right?" The truth was, no, everything was not all right. And it was becoming harder and harder to pretend otherwise. The next week, Mrs. Caldwell brought over a small jar of rose jam she had made. She handed it to me with a smile. "I thought you might like this," she said. Then, almost in a whisper, "And Maggie, if you ever need someone to talk to, you know where I am." I thanked her, my voice thick with unshed tears. I wanted to tell her everything about the baskets of beans tossed away, the carrots discarded like trash, the way my son looked at me as though my efforts were shameful. But I couldn't. The words felt like a betrayal of my own family. Instead, I stood there clutching the jar of jam, wondering how much longer I could carry this burden alone. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, Mrs. Caldwell's voice echoing in my mind. She had seen more than I wanted her to. And I knew deep down that if a neighbor could sense it, others might too. That thought both terrified and comforted me. Terrified because I had spent years protecting Daniel, shielding his unkindness from the outside world. Comforted because maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as invisible as I felt. The garden outside continued to grow lush and abundant. Every morning the vines seemed to whisper, "We see you. We hear you. We know your worth." But inside the house, Daniel's shadow loomed ready to strip me of that worth, with every careless toss into the garbage. For the first time, I began to wonder if silence was protecting him or destroying me. Dinner used to be a sacred time in our family. When Richard was alive, he would insist on all of us gathering around the table no matter how busy the day had been. He believed food wasn't just about nourishment, but about connection, about looking each other in the eyes and knowing we belonged to one another. Those dinners were filled with laughter stories, even arguments that ended in smiles. Now dinner feels like a battlefield where I am always on the losing side. That evening, I had tried my best to prepare something special. A chicken casserole seasoned carefully with a side of roasted carrots and green beans from my garden. I had hidden the vegetables, well, slicing them, finely mixing them with olive oil and herbs so that perhaps Daniel wouldn't notice. I needed him to taste them without prejudice, to see they were good to see. I was good. As we sat down, I served him a plate and watched anxiously. His wife Claire smiled politely, but I caught the way she glanced at the beans with a faint frown. Daniel picked up his fork, speared a bean, lifted it halfway to his mouth, and then paused. His face hardened. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying that sharp edge I knew too well, "are these from your garden?" The room fell silent. I froze, my fork hovering above my plate. "Yes," I admitted softly. "I thought." He dropped the bean onto the plate with a clatter, pushing the dish away as though it were poisoned. "How many times do I have to tell you? We don't want this." My throat tightened. "Daniel, they're fresh. They're good. Just try them." He leaned back, folding his arms. His tone grew louder, crueler. "I said we don't want them. Claire and I are not guinea pigs for your little farm experiments." Claire shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between us. She opened her mouth, perhaps to calm him, but said nothing. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks. My hands trembled under the table, but I forced myself to speak. "It's not an experiment. It's food. Food I worked hard for. Food that's—" He cut me off with a laugh, sharp and hollow. "Worked hard. Mom, you dig around in the dirt all day like some old woman with nothing better to do. You think that's hard work? It's pathetic." The word hit me like a slap. Pathetic. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Claire lowered her gaze, embarrassed by his cruelty. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the humiliation. I tried to steady my voice. "Daniel, when your father was alive, we ate from this garden together. He loved it. He said nothing tasted better than what grew from our own soil." For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Discomfort, maybe even guilt. But it vanished quickly, replaced by a sneer. "Well, Dad's not here, is he? Times change. Nobody cares about that old-fashioned nonsense anymore." I gasped quietly. His words weren't just about the vegetables. They were about me. About everything I represented: the past, the traditions, the love I carried like a fragile ember. To him, I was old-fashioned nonsense. I lowered my fork, my appetite gone. My hands trembled so badly I had to place them in my lap. I could feel tears pricking the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. He would not see me break. Claire finally spoke, her voice timid. "Daniel, maybe we could just try a little. They do look nice." He shot her a look that silenced her instantly. Then he turned back to me. "Mom, stop forcing this. Stop shoving your hobby into our lives. We don't want it. Do you understand? The cruelty in his tone stripped me bare. For years, I had stayed quiet, swallowing his dismissals, telling myself he didn't mean it, that he was tired or stressed. But tonight, in front of his wife, with his words cutting so deep, something inside me cracked. I whispered, barely audible, "It's not vegetables you're throwing away, Daniel. It's me." The words slipped out before I could stop them, fragile but true. The table went still. Daniel froze, his expression tightening, as though my words had struck a chord he didn't want to acknowledge. Claire's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. I sat there staring at him, my voice trembling but firm now. "Every bean, every tomato, every carrot you throw in the trash. That's me you're discarding. My work, my care, my love. You don't even see it." For the first time, Daniel didn't immediately respond. He looked away, his jaw tense, his hands clenched into fists. The silence stretched on until it became unbearable. Finally, he pushed back his chair and stood up. "Enough," he said coldly. "I don't have time for this guilt trip." Without another word, he walked out of the room, leaving his untouched plate behind. Claire hesitated, glancing at me with something like pity, but then she followed him, leaving me alone at the table. I sat there in the silence, staring at the roasted beans and carrots glistening under the kitchen light. They looked so small, so innocent, yet they had become weapons in this war I never wanted. My hands were still trembling, but inside me something had shifted. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was angry. For years, I had let him treat me this way, convincing myself that keeping the peace was more important than defending myself. But sitting there at that table, staring at the food he had mocked, I realized the truth. Silence had only given him more power. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and whispered into the empty room, "No more, Daniel. No more." That night, I went to bed with a storm in my chest. My body trembled with both pain and a new, unfamiliar strength. I didn't know yet what I would do, but I knew one thing: I would not let him keep throwing me away. And for the first time in years, instead of feeling small, I felt something stir inside me. A spark. I was beginning to see that his cruelty wasn't just about vegetables. It was about control, about erasing me, and I would not be erased. After that clash at the dinner table, the air in the house grew thick with silence. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the heavy kind that presses down on you, fills your lungs, and makes breathing itself feel like a burden. Daniel avoided me more than usual, and Claire walked on eggshells, as though afraid that one wrong word might trigger another storm. But I couldn't let it rest. His cruelty had been gnawing at me for too long, and I needed to know why. Why did my garden bother him so much? Why did he despise something that brought me joy? The answer came to me in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was assembling. It started when I overheard him on the phone one afternoon. I was in the living room folding laundry when Daniel walked into the kitchen to take a call. His voice was low but sharp. "No, man, I told you. Don't come over unannounced. My mom's, you know, she's always out in the yard with her little garden. It's embarrassing. Embarrassing." The word echoed through me like a bell tolling. I froze, clutching a towel in my hands, straining to hear. "No, I'm serious," he continued. "Claire already hates it. Looks so country. Like we're living with some old woman who can't move on. Just buy from the store when you come here, all right. Don't expect her junk." I stood there in the shadow of the hallway, my heart pounding. Junk. Embarrassing. Old woman. He wasn't just throwing away my vegetables. He was trying to erase me from the image of his life. Suddenly, the pattern made sense. The way he always trashed my harvest before guests arrived. The way he dismissed my dishes at dinner when friends were around. He wasn't worried about the food itself, he was worried about appearances. To him, my garden didn't represent healing or survival. It represented poverty, backwardness, something he didn't want, associated with his modern polished life. The realization cut deeper than any insult. That evening, I couldn't eat. I sat in my room staring at the floor, my mind swirling. Richard and I had built this house with our bare hands, planting that garden together, so we could feed our family with pride. And now our son was ashamed of it, ashamed of me. When Daniel came in later that night, I couldn't hold my tongue. I stepped into the kitchen where he was rummaging through the fridge. "Daniel," I said quietly, "why are you embarrassed by my garden?" He froze his back to me. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he sighed and turned around, irritation etched across his face. "Mom, don't start." "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Tell me the truth. I heard you on the phone. You told someone it was embarrassing. That I'm embarrassing." His jaw clenched. He didn't deny it. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck and muttered, "Because it is, Mom. It makes us look small, like we can't afford real food. Like we're some kind of backwater family living off the dirt." I stared at him, stunned. "Is that what you think of me? That I make you look poor? That my garden is shameful?" He looked away, refusing to meet my eyes. "It's not just me. Claire feels the same. We're trying to build a life here, Mom. A future. And you keep clinging to the past, to these peasant habits. It's embarrassing when people come over. They'll think we're low class." Low class. The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt my hands shaking, but I forced them still. "Daniel," I whispered, "that garden kept me alive after your father died. It's not dirt and peas and beans. It's my heart. It's my soul. And you call it low class." He finally looked at me then, and for a flicker of a second I thought I saw guilt in his eyes. But just as quickly it was gone. He hardened his face and shrugged. "I didn't ask you to keep it. If it matters that much to you, fine. But don't expect me to play along. And don't shove it into our lives like it's something to be proud of." With that, he walked out, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my body trembling with a storm of emotions: sorrow, anger, disbelief. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing Richard's voice in my memory. "Maggie, the earth never lies. What you put into it, it gives back. Don't let anyone make you feel small for loving it." Tears slid silently down my cheeks. Daniel didn't see the garden as healing, as dignity. He saw it as a stain, a mark of shame. And instead of protecting me, instead of standing by me, he chose to tear me down to preserve some false image of success. But something inside me shifted again. His confession, cruel as it was, gave me clarity. It wasn't about vegetables. It was about pride, his and mine. He was ashamed of me, and I was ashamed of how long I had let him make me feel worthless. The next morning, I went into the garden as the sun rose, the dew clinging to the leaves. I knelt in the soil, touched the earth, and whispered, "You are not shameful. And neither am I." From that day, I began to see Daniel differently. Not as the boy I raised, but as a man who had chosen to forget where he came from. And while he might have power in this house, I still had power in myself. I began to hide my harvest, not out of fear, but out of defiance. I stored tomatoes in jars in the cellar, slipped carrots into paper bags, and shared them with Mrs. Caldwell, left baskets of beans at the church doorstep. Quietly, secretly, I gave life where my son tried to destroy it. Each time I gave away my vegetables, I felt a small victory. Each time someone thanked me, praised the taste, or smiled at the gift, I felt my dignity return piece by piece. Daniel might see shame in the garden, but the world outside did not. And I would prove it to him one day. Because the truth was clear now, he wasn't throwing away vegetables. He was throwing away me. And I had no intention of letting him succeed. There's a moment in every mother's life when silence becomes unbearable. For me, it wasn't a single word or even one cruel act that pushed me there. It was the slow, steady erosion of my dignity. Each vegetable tossed in the trash, each sneer at my garden, each dismissal of my worth had been like water dripping on stone. Over time, it carved out a canyon in my chest, but one day I couldn't hold it in anymore. It was late afternoon, the kind of summer day where the air is heavy with heat and the cicadas scream in the trees like they're warning of something coming. I had just returned from the garden with a basket of tomatoes, plump red, bursting with juice, the kind you can't buy in any store. My hands were dirty, my hair damp with sweat, but my heart swelled with pride. I placed the basket on the kitchen counter, humming softly to myself as I rinsed a few under the faucet. For a moment, I let myself dream slicing them with fresh basil, maybe surprising Claire with a simple caprese salad, maybe she'd smile and say thank you. But when I turned around, there was Daniel standing in the doorway. His eyes landed on the basket, and instantly his jaw tightened. "Mom," he said, his tone sharp again. With this, I froze, water still dripping from the tomato in my hand. "It's just a few," I said carefully. I thought he crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed the basket and lifted it as though it were nothing more than garbage. "Daniel," I cried, reaching for it, but he pulled it away, heading toward the back door. That was it. Something inside me snapped. My chest burned. My hands shook, but my voice came out strong, louder than I'd ever dared. "Stop." The word ricocheted through the kitchen. He froze mid-step, startled. I had never shouted at him like that before. Slowly, he turned the basket, still in his hands. My heart pounded, but I didn't let the fear control me. I stepped forward, my eyes locked on his. My voice trembled, but it carried. "It's not vegetables you're throwing away, Daniel. It's me." He blinked, taken aback. "What?" I moved closer, my words spilling out raw and unfiltered. "Every tomato, every bean, every carrot. That's my time, my care, my love. Do you know how many hours I spend in that soil? Do you know what it means to me? That garden saved me after your father died. It gave me a reason to keep living when I thought I couldn't. And every time you throw my harvest into the trash, you're telling me I don't matter." His expression hardened, but I pressed on, my voice breaking yet firm. "You think it's just food? But it's not. It's my life. And I won't let you discard me like garbage anymore." For a long moment, silence filled the room. He stared at me, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the basket. His eyes flickered with something: anger, guilt, shame, I couldn't tell. Then he scoffed, shaking his head. "Mom, you're being dramatic." The word dramatic stung, but I stood my ground. "No, Daniel. I've been silent for too long. I've let you belittle me, humiliate me, treat me like I'm nothing. But I am something. And you don't get to erase me because you're ashamed." His eyes narrowed. "Ashamed of what? Of me?" I cried, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. "Of your own mother. You throw away my vegetables because you don't want people to think you come from someone like me. You told your friends it's embarrassing. That I'm embarrassing." He froze, his face paling. He hadn't expected me to know. I took a shaky breath, my voice soft but sharp as a blade. "Well, let me tell you something, Daniel. I'd rather be a woman who kneels in the dirt to grow life than a man who throws away his own mother's love to look important. You call me shameful? No. The shame is yours." The words hung heavy in the air. He stood there, stunned, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. For once, he didn't have a quick retort. Finally, he slammed the basket back onto the counter, the tomatoes rolling across the surface with dull thuds. His face twisted with anger, but beneath it I saw something else. The faintest flicker of fear. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low. "Keep your garden. Do whatever you want. But don't expect me to be part of it." He turned and stormed out of the kitchen, the door slamming behind him. I stood there, my body trembling from head to toe, my tears dripping onto the counter. The tomatoes lay scattered, bruised from his carelessness. I gathered them, gently cradling them in my hands as though they were pieces of myself I refused to let him break. In that moment, I felt both shattered and stronger than I'd ever been. For years, I had swallowed my pain, convincing myself that silence was love, that endurance was loyalty. But silence had made me invisible. Today I had spoken. Today he had heard me whether he wanted to or not. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the confrontation again and again. The look on his face when I told him he was ashamed of me. The way his voice faltered even for just a second. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a crack in his armor. And in that crack, I saw possibility. I realized then that my fight wasn't just about vegetables or gardening. It was about dignity. About reclaiming the voice I had lost after Richard died. About reminding Daniel that I was not some burden to be discarded, but a mother, a woman, a human being with worth. As I lay awake, I whispered into the dark, "You won't throw me away again, Daniel. I won't let you." And with that vow, I felt something new blooming inside me, not just defiance, but power. Quiet, steady, unyielding power. The kind that grows roots so deep no storm can rip it out. After that confrontation, the house became quieter, but not in the way I hoped. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a truce neither of us had agreed upon. Daniel avoided me more than usual, his words clipped. When he had to speak, his eyes quick to look away when mine sought them. Claire tried to act as though everything was normal, but her nervous glances betrayed her discomfort. I no longer left my vegetables on the counter. I didn't dare. But I also refused to stop planting watering harvesting. If my garden was the symbol of my survival, then letting it die would mean surrender. And I was done surrendering. So I found another way. The first act of resistance was small. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I gathered a basket of tomatoes, cucumbers, and beans. Instead of bringing them inside, I carried them next door. Mrs. Caldwell was sitting on her porch, fanning herself against the heavy summer air. When she saw me approaching with the basket, her eyes lit up. "Oh, Maggie," she said warmly, "these look beautiful." I smiled, though my throat ached. "They're from my garden. I thought you might enjoy them." She accepted the basket with both hands as though I'd given her treasure. "I will thank you. You've always had such a gift with the soil." Her words were balm to my wounded spirit. For the first time in a long while, my vegetables were not thrown away. They were received, valued, wanted. That night, lying in bed, I thought about her smile, about the way her fingers lingered on the tomatoes as if they were jewels. And I realized something: Daniel could discard my efforts in this house, but he could not erase their worth in the world beyond it. So my quiet rebellion began. Each week I harvested what I could and carried it in small bundles to people who would cherish it. Mrs. Caldwell, the pastor's wife at church, the young mother down the street who was always struggling to stretch her grocery budget. I left baskets on doorsteps, jars of preserved tomatoes in gift bags, bundles of herbs tied with twine. I said little, offered no explanations, just gave. And in giving, I reclaimed what Daniel tried to steal from me: my dignity. The first Sunday I brought a basket to church, the women crowded around. "These are better than anything from the store," one said, holding up a cucumber. "Do you grow these all yourself?" another asked, admiration in her tone. I nodded, shy but proud. "Yes, in my backyard." They smiled, praised, thanked me. Their words sank into me like water into parched soil. I walked home lighter than I had felt in years. When Daniel asked later why I hadn't left anything in the kitchen that week, I simply said I didn't pick much. He shrugged, uninterested, and that was the end of it. He didn't notice the jars of pickles missing from the cellar or the small bundles wrapped in paper that I slipped into my purse before leaving the house. My secret life blossomed. At first, it was just vegetables, but soon I began making small dishes for others: zucchini bread for Mrs. Caldwell, tomato soup for the pastor's wife, roasted carrots for the young mother. Each time, the gratitude in their eyes reminded me that what Daniel threw away so carelessly was, in truth, a gift others treasured. In those quiet exchanges, I felt myself returning. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't worthless. I was a giver, a nurturer, someone who still had something meaningful to offer the world. And yet, every time I handed over a basket or dish, a flicker of bitterness burned in me. Why could strangers and neighbors see my worth while my own son refused? Why was I forced to hide, to give away my pride in secret just to keep it from being destroyed in my own home? One evening, as I walked back from Mrs. Caldwell's, I paused at the edge of my garden. The moonlight bathed the rows of beans and tomatoes, the leaves shimmering like silver. I knelt down, touched the soil, and whispered, "Thank you." The garden had become my ally in this war. Daniel thought he had won by shaming me into silence, but he hadn't. He didn't know that every seed I planted was another act of defiance. Every basket I shared was another thread of my dignity woven back together. But I knew it couldn't stay secret forever. Secrets, like seeds, have a way of growing until they burst through the surface. And deep down, I wanted Daniel to see, not for his approval, but for the truth. The truth that what he threw away was valuable, that what he mocked was cherished, that what he called shame was in fact pride. One night, as I lay in bed, I imagined a future confrontation. I pictured myself standing in front of him, surrounded by neighbors holding baskets of my vegetables, their voices rising in praise. I imagined Daniel's face crumbling as he realized the world saw me differently than he did. The thought both thrilled and frightened me. For now, I kept my rebellion quiet. But with each passing week, as more neighbors asked for my tomatoes, as more families thanked me for my beans, I felt the strength inside me grow. And I began to wonder, maybe the sweetest revenge isn't always loud or immediate. Maybe it's in the patience of the harvest, in the slow, steady proof that what others discard can bloom into something undeniable. Because while Daniel thought he was throwing away my worth, I was planting it elsewhere, where it could never be uprooted. And one day, he would see it. He would have no choice. The quiet rebellion I had built for myself carried me through the summer. Each time I shared a basket of vegetables or heard a neighbor praise my cooking, I felt the invisible bruises inside me begin to heal. I still carried Daniel's words with me, embarrassing, shameful, pathetic, but the weight of them was lightened every time someone smiled gratefully and said, "Maggie, these are wonderful." For a while, I believed I could live this way, balancing the secret dignity I found outside the house with the contempt I endured within it. I told myself it was enough, that as long as I had my garden and the small community of people who valued it, Daniel's cruelty couldn't break me completely. But then came the festival. Every year, our town held a late summer gathering on the square music food stalls contests, children running under strings of lights as the evening cooled. It was the kind of tradition that stitched the town together, a reminder that no matter how busy life became, we still belonged to something larger than ourselves. This year, Mrs. Caldwell insisted I bring some of my vegetables to the festival potluck. "Maggie," she said, her voice kind but firm, "people should see what you can do. You have a gift, and it deserves to be shared." At first, I resisted. The thought of putting my work on display, knowing Daniel would be there, filled me with dread. But she was persuasive, and part of me longed to stand in the open to show the world that what my son mocked had value. So I prepared a large dish of roasted vegetables seasoned with herbs from my garden, drizzled with olive oil. The colors were vibrant, the smell inviting. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of pride burn bright enough to cast out the fear. When I arrived at the festival with the dish in hand, I placed it on the long table among pies, casseroles, and salads. Within minutes, people began to taste it. I watched from a distance, my heart thudding, as one woman leaned to another and whispered, "This is delicious. Who made it?" A man reached for seconds, nodding with approval. My chest swelled. My food was being enjoyed, celebrated, valued. Then Daniel arrived. He was walking with a group of colleagues from work, his voice loud, his laughter even louder. He looked every bit the polished man he wanted to be pressed, shirt confident stride, the kind of man who wanted the world to believe he had risen above his roots. Claire trailed behind, polite and quiet, her smile carefully placed on her lips. I froze when I saw him approach the table. My dish was nearly empty now, the serving spoon coated with herbs and oil. People had loved it. I prayed he wouldn't notice whose it was, but fate rarely spares us. One of his colleagues pointed to the dish and said, "This is incredible. Who made it?" Before I could step forward, before I could speak, Daniel laughed. A sharp cutting sound. "Oh, that you don't want to know," he said. The group chuckled, confused. "What do you mean?" one of them asked. Daniel leaned closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "My mom made it. From her little garden." He said the word as though it were filth. "She thinks she's some kind of farmer. But trust me, half the time her stuff tastes like dirt." The laughter that followed pierced me like knives. My knees weakened, my hands trembled at my sides. He didn't stop there. "She's obsessed with it," he went on, smirking. "Spends hours in the backyard playing in the mud like a kid. Can you imagine? At her age, it's, honestly, kind of sad." My breath caught in my throat. Sad. Pathetic. Embarrassing. Words he had thrown at me in private now spilled into the open in front of strangers, in front of his colleagues. I felt naked, exposed, humiliated. My dish, which had brought me pride just minutes earlier, now sat like evidence of my shame. People glanced at me, some with pity, some with awkwardness, no one daring to contradict him. I wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground like a seed and never be seen again. But then something happened. A woman I didn't know well, a teacher from the local school, spoke up. She had a plate in her hand, my vegetables piled high. She looked at Daniel, her eyes sharp, and said, "Well, if this is your mother's cooking, then she should be proud. This is one of the best things on the table tonight." Another man chimed in, nodding. "She's got a real talent. Better than store-bought, that's for sure." The group murmured agreement, some going back for thirds, praising the flavor. My cheeks flushed, not with shame this time, but with a sudden fragile sense of vindication. Daniel's smirk faltered. He laughed again, but it was thinner now, forced. "Well, I guess everyone has different tastes." He waved it off, changing the subject. But I saw it. The crack in his mask. The way his eyes flickered with unease, the way he clenched his jaw. Still, the damage had been done. His words had sliced through me, and though others' praise soothed some of the sting, the humiliation lingered. I had never felt so betrayed. It wasn't enough for him to throw my efforts into the trash at home. Now he had dragged my dignity into the street and mocked it for all to see. That night when I returned home, I sat in the garden under the stars, tears streaming down my face. The plants rustled softly in the breeze, their leaves glowing faintly in the moonlight. They seemed to whisper, "You are not worthless. You are not shameful. You are ours, and we are yours." I wiped my tears, my chest heaving with both sorrow and fury. Daniel thought he had humiliated me, thought he had silenced me by making a mockery of my love. But what he didn't realize was that humiliation can be a seed, too. And seeds, once planted, grow. That night, I promised myself one day I would show him. One day I would gather every bit of proof, every voice of praise, every piece of evidence that what I grew mattered. And when I revealed it, he would have no choice but to face the truth. How do you think they will react when I reveal that to everyone? The night of the festival burned into my memory like a scar. Daniel's words still echoed in my ears, embarrassing, sad, pathetic. His laughter still rang sharp and cruel, and the looks of pity from strangers clung to me like dust I couldn't shake off. But what stayed with me even more was the teacher's voice, strong and certain she should be proud. "This is one of the best things on the table tonight. for days after I turned that sentence over in my mind like a stone in my pocket. Each time it reminded me that Daniel's words weren't truth, they were his shame dressed up as judgment. And if even one stranger could see the worth in what I grew, then I had a chance to prove to everyone and to Daniel most of all that he was wrong. So I began to collect evidence. It started small. After the festival, Mrs. Caldwell returned one of my baskets empty except for a folded note tucked inside. It read, "Maggie, your tomatoes were the sweetest I've ever tasted. Thank you for sharing. Please let me know when you have more." My heart ached as I read it, but not from pain, from vindication. I tucked the note carefully into an old recipe box in my room, as though it were a letter of testimony. Next came the young mother down the street. One morning she stopped me as I was clipping basil from the garden. She had her little boy in tow, his hands sticky from jam. "Mrs. Allen," she said breathlessly, "those carrots you gave us. He ate them raw. He never eats vegetables." But he wouldn't stop asking for more. "Thank you. You don't know what that means." I smiled, blinking back tears, and later that day I wrote her words down on a scrap of paper. That too went into the recipe box. Week by week the box began to fill. Notes of thanks. Recipes people had shared back with me. Even a photo Mrs. Caldwell had taken of her granddaughter holding up one of my cucumbers, grinning from ear to ear. Every piece was proof, living, undeniable proof that what Daniel called shameful was in fact valuable. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. It was my secret harvest, as important as the vegetables themselves. Each word of praise, each smile, each empty plate was a seed of dignity I was planting deep inside myself. And slowly the evidence grew too large to ignore. At church, people began asking Maggie, "Do you have more of those beans? My husband hasn't stopped talking about them." Or, "Could you write down how you made that zucchini bread?" My daughter loved it. Each request filled me with a quiet pride. I began to save jars of pickles, freeze batches of soup, and write down every recipe that began with something from my soil. But the moment that cemented my resolve came unexpectedly. One afternoon, Claire came into the kitchen while I was packing a small basket to deliver to the pastor's wife. She watched me for a moment, silent, then said softly, "They really do like your vegetables, don't they?" Her tone wasn't mocking. It was curious, almost wistful. I looked up, surprised. "Yes, they do." She hesitated, biting her lip. "Daniel doesn't see it, but I know people talk about them. In a good way. I've heard it myself." Her words stunned me. For the first time, I saw a crack in the wall she had built around herself, the careful neutrality she always wore when Daniel lashed out. For the first time, she acknowledged the truth I had been forced to carry alone. I wanted to reach for her to tell her thank you, but I only nodded. "They do," I said, simply because anything more would have broken me into tears. That evening, after she had gone upstairs, I wrote her words down too. Even Claire admits people praise them. Into the box it went. By now, the recipe box was overflowing. I had to find a larger container, so I chose one of Richard's old toolboxes from the shed. Strong, heavy, built to last. It seemed fitting. Inside, I stored every scrap of evidence, notes, recipes, photographs, even dried flowers from a bouquet Mrs. Caldwell had pressed into my hands in thanks. Each piece was a truth Daniel could not throw away, and the more I collected, the bolder I became. I started keeping a ledger listing names and compliments, dates, and dishes. Mrs. Caldwell cucumbers said sweetest she's had in years. Pastor's wife zucchini bread asked for recipe. Teacher at festival roasted vegetables called it the best dish. Line by line, the evidence grew into a story one Daniel couldn't dismiss with a laugh. At night, when I sat in bed with the box at my feet, I imagined the day I would open it in front of him. I imagined spreading out every note, every picture, every word of praise and saying, "See, you tried to bury me in shame, but here is the truth. The world values what you discard." The thought both terrified and thrilled me. For so long I had been small in his shadow, silenced by his cruelty. But now, with each piece of evidence, I was building not just a defense, I was building a reckoning. One afternoon, as I carried a basket of tomatoes to the church, I caught sight of Daniel through the window laughing with a friend on the phone. His voice carried arrogant and dismissive. Yeah, she's still at it. Out in the yard every day, like she thinks she's running a farm. Pathetic, right? My chest tightened, but this time, instead of crumbling, I whispered to myself, say what you want, Daniel. The evidence is growing, and one day you won't be able to laugh it away. Because while he thought he was burying me, I was gathering the seeds of my revenge. Quiet, steady, undeniable. And when the time came to open that toolbox, the harvest would be one he could never throw away. The toolbox under my bed grew heavier with each passing week. Not just from the paper photos and recipes tucked inside, but from the weight of everything it represented. Each note of thanks, each compliment, each smile I recorded was a stone of truth, building a wall against the years of Daniel's scorn. I began to feel a strange calm when I touched that box. It was my shield, my sword, my voice, waiting to be unleashed. And I knew exactly when I would open it. Claire's birthday was approaching. She had planned a small family gathering at our house, just relatives, a few close friends, and some neighbors. Daniel was proud of the idea, boasting about it as though the home and all its comforts were entirely his doing. I watched him brag, watched Claire nod along politely, and thought, this is it. This is where the truth will bloom. The days leading up to the party were a blur of preparations. Claire decorated the dining room with pastel streamers and flowers. Daniel ordered catering, making sure nothing homemade would appear on the table. I stayed quiet, helping with small tasks, keeping my hands steady even as my heart thundered with the weight of what I planned to do. On the morning of the party, I went into the garden at dawn. The dew clung to the leaves and the first light painted the tomatoes in shades of fire. I harvested carefully tomatoes, beans, cucumbers, carrots, arranging them into baskets lined with cloth. Each vegetable gleamed like proof of life, proof of worth. I set them aside, ready for the moment they would take center stage. When guests began to arrive that evening, laughter and chatter filled the house. The dining table was covered with catered dishes, bottles of wine, neatly folded napkins. Daniel moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man proud of his image. I stayed at the edge, quiet but watchful, the toolbox resting beneath the table where I sat. It was after dinner, when the plates were being cleared and people began to linger with glasses of wine, that I chose my moment. Daniel was standing with a group of relatives, his voice loud as always. And then I heard it, the same mockery I had endured for years. She still messes with that garden, he said with a laugh. You should see it, rows of beans and carrots, like she thinks she's running a farm. Honestly, it's embarrassing. Something inside me snapped. My hands tightened around the edge of the toolbox. The time had come. I stood, my voice ringing louder than I expected. Embarrassing. The room fell silent. Every head turned toward me. Daniel's laughter froze on his lips, his eyes narrowing. I stepped forward, dragging the toolbox with me. My hands trembled, but my voice was steady. You've spent years mocking me, Daniel. Throwing away what I grow. Telling people I'm pathetic. But tonight, everyone will see the truth. Before anyone could speak, I opened the toolbox and began laying its contents on the table. Notes of thanks, photographs, recipes written in other people's hands. Letters praising my tomatoes. Slips of paper recording compliments about my zucchini bread. A picture of Mrs. Caldwell's granddaughter holding one of my cucumbers like a prize. Gasps filled the room as the evidence spread across the table like a quilt of testimony. Guests leaned in, reading, whispering. Claire covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. This, I said, my voice breaking with both pain and pride, is what you've been throwing away. Not dirt, not junk. Life, love, healing, proof that what I do matters. I lifted one note high, reading aloud, "Maggie, your tomatoes were the sweetest I've ever tasted. Thank you for sharing." I set it down and picked up another. "My son never eats vegetables, but he ate yours raw and begged for more." One after another, I laid them out, my voice rising with each word. "You told people I was pathetic," I said, my gaze locking on Daniel. "You told them my garden was shameful. But these voices, these neighbors, these friends, they know the truth. They see what you refuse to see. They value what you discard." Daniel's face flushed red, his jaw tight. "Mom, this is ridiculous." "No," I snapped the word, shaking the air. "What's ridiculous is a son so ashamed of his own mother that he would rather lie, rather throw her love into the trash than admit she has worth." The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye was on him. He opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. For once, his arrogance faltered. He looked around as though expecting someone to laugh with him, but all he saw were frowns, shaking heads, eyes filled with disappointment. Then Mrs. Caldwell's voice rang out from the back. She had been invited by Claire. She stepped forward, her head held high. "Maggie's vegetables aren't shameful, they're a blessing. And anyone who throws them away doesn't know the value of real work or real love." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. One guest added, "I had her zucchini bread last week. Better than anything you can buy." Another said, "Her garden has fed half the street." We all know it. Daniel's mask cracked. He looked cornered, his bravado collapsing under the weight of truth. His hands clenched into fists, but his voice was weak when he muttered, "You're all making too big a deal out of this." But the room was no longer with him. It was with me. I straightened my shoulders, squaring for the first time in years. "Daniel," I said quietly, "you tried to make me invisible. But tonight everyone sees me. They see my work. They see my worth. You cannot throw me away anymore." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of judgment for him. Full of vindication for me. He stormed out of the room, his footsteps heavy, the door slamming behind him. Claire remained, tears in her eyes, whispering softly, "Maggie, I'm sorry." I sat down then, exhausted but unbroken. My hands still trembled, but my heart beat with a rhythm I hadn't felt in years, the rhythm of dignity reclaimed at last. For the first time in a long while, I felt the balance shift. Daniel's lies had been exposed. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. It was out in the open, undeniable, unshakable. And as I looked at the scattered notes and photographs glowing under the light, I knew one thing: the harvest of my revenge had only just begun. After the confrontation at Claire's birthday gathering, the house no longer felt the same. The air had shifted. For years, Daniel's voice had dominated every room, his laughter loud, his scorn sharp, his dismissals final. But now it was different. Now, whenever he spoke, the echo of my words and the voices of others defending me seemed to linger in the background. He tried to act as though nothing had happened. The very next morning, he came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee, silent but tense. His movements were stiff, his jaw tight. He didn't look at me. I watched him, waiting for the sarcasm, the cutting remark, but none came. Just silence. That silence spoke louder than anything. For the first time, I saw him not as the confident, dismissive man he tried to be, but as someone cornered, stripped of his illusions. His power over me, the mockery, the contempt, the way he could twist his shame into my burden had been broken. And he knew it. Still, there was no apology, none of the simple words I longed to hear. "I'm sorry, Mom. I was wrong." But even without them, I could feel the shift. Over the next week, I noticed the smallest things. The vegetables I left on the counter weren't thrown away. He didn't touch them, didn't eat them, but they weren't discarded either. They simply sat there, ignored but allowed to exist. That in itself was an admission. Once I caught Claire slicing a cucumber for a salad. She glanced at me nervously as though afraid Daniel would appear, but when he didn't, she smiled faintly and placed the bowl on the table. We ate in silence, but inside I glowed. My garden had reached the table again. Still beneath the fragile victories, I felt something deeper stirring reflection. For years, I had begged for scraps of recognition, holding out hope that Daniel would one day smile at me, say he was proud, taste my food, and declare it good. But after the gathering, after seeing the truth laid bare, I realized I had been asking the wrong question. The question wasn't, will my son ever respect me? The question was, do I respect myself enough to stop needing his approval? That night, I sat in the garden under the stars, the soil cool beneath my hands. The plants rustled in the breeze, tall and strong despite all that had been thrown away. And I whispered to them as though they were my oldest friends, I don't need his praise. I don't need his permission. My worth is not in his hands. For so long, I had let Daniel's rejection define me. I had equated his contempt with my value, as though I could only exist through his acceptance. But the truth was clear now. My life, my healing, my dignity, they were mine. And no amount of ridicule could erase that. A few days later, Daniel finally broke his silence. It was evening, the house quiet, when he came into the living room where I was knitting. He stood awkwardly, his hands in his pockets, his eyes avoiding mine. "Mom," he said, his voice low about the other night. I looked up, waiting. He shifted uncomfortably. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. People, they just don't understand." It wasn't an apology. Not really. It was a deflection, a half-hearted attempt to justify himself. But there was something in his tone, not arrogance, not dismissal, but uncertainty. The bravado was gone. I set my knitting aside, my voice calm. Daniel, people understood perfectly. They saw the truth. And so did you. He flinched slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You made me look bad." I shook my head slowly. "No, Daniel. You did that yourself. I simply showed what you tried to hide." Silence stretched between us. Finally, I said, softer now, "Do you know what I wanted all these years? Not praise, not even gratitude, just respect. Respect for the time, the effort, the love I put into something. Because respect, Daniel, is more nourishing than any food. Without it, a family starves no matter how much is on the table." He swallowed hard, his jaw working as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. Finally, he muttered, "I don't want to talk about this anymore," and left the room. But I knew he had heard me, and sometimes being heard is enough. That night, I slept deeply, peacefully. For once, I didn't lie awake replaying his insults, wondering what I could do differently to earn his love. Instead, I dreamt of Richard smiling at me in the garden, his hands brushing the soil as he said, "You've done well, Maggie. You've kept growing." The next morning, I carried a basket of fresh beans to the church. As I walked down the street, neighbors waved, smiled, asked if I had more of those tomatoes they loved. Their voices lifted me higher than Daniel's ever could. For the first time, I realized I didn't need him to change in order to reclaim my life. I had already reclaimed it. I still hoped deep in my heart that he might see one day, really see me, not as an embarrassment, but as his mother, a woman who had given him everything she could. But whether that day came or not, I was no longer defined by his blindness. I was defined by my own resilience, by the soil beneath my nails, by the quiet power of roots that grow deeper no matter how many times their fruits are discarded. And with that realization, I felt free. The garden is quiet now. The air has cooled, autumn creeping in with its softer winds and golden light. The vines are thinning, the last of the beans drying on their stalks, the tomatoes ripening slower, smaller. Soon the earth will rest, and so will I. I sit on the porch most mornings watching the garden like a mother watching her children grow and leave home. I've spent another season tending it, and once again it has given me more than I ever expected. Not just food, but lessons. Not just vegetables, but dignity. Daniel doesn't say much to me these days. He comes and goes, his words polite, but short, his eyes avoiding mine more often than not. Sometimes I catch a flicker of something in him when he passes the garden, guilt maybe, or defiance. I don't press him anymore. I don't beg him to see me, don't chase after his approval. I've learned that his blindness is his burden to carry, not mine. Claire, on the other hand, has softened toward me. Once I found her quietly snipping basil from my garden, her hands careful, almost reverent. She looked up startled when she saw me, but I only smiled. She smiled back, a small, genuine smile that said more than words ever could. It's not forgiveness I live with now, nor reconciliation, not yet. It's acceptance. Acceptance that my son may never fully understand the harm he caused, may never offer the apology I once craved. Acceptance that the respect I needed, I had to give to myself first. The truth is, the garden gave me that respect long before anyone else did. Each seed I planted reminded me of my strength. Each sprout reminded me that patience bears fruit. Each harvest reminded me that my efforts were never wasted, even if someone tried to throw them away. Because I learned something important: when someone discards you, it doesn't mean you are worthless. It means they are blind. I think often about that night at the gathering when I laid out all the notes and photos, when voices rose around me to defend what Daniel had mocked for years. I remember the look on his face, the mask cracking, the truth pressing in. It wasn't triumph I felt then, not exactly. It was something deeper. Liberation. For years I carried the shame he forced on me, but that night I set it down. And once you set down shame, you don't pick it up again. Neighbors still come by for vegetables. Mrs. Caldwell stops often, her arms open for both cucumbers and conversation. The young mother down the street still marvels at how her boy eats my carrots as though they're candy. At church, people ask for my recipes, and I write them out neatly on little cards, smiling as I hand them over. Each smile, each thank you, each request is another reminder I am seen. I am valued. Sometimes late at night, I sit with Richard's photo in my hands. I tell him about the garden, about how it saved me once more, about how our son lost his way. And I imagine him answering in that calm, steady voice of his, "You did what you had to do, Maggie. You kept growing. And that's all anyone can ask." I still ache, of course. A mother always does when her child turns cruel. The wound doesn't vanish just because dignity returns, but pain and dignity can live side by side. The pain reminds me of what I lost. The dignity reminds me of what I reclaimed. And I reclaimed everything. This autumn, as I prepare the soil for winter, I whisper to the earth the truth I've finally learned. You cannot throw me away. I am not garbage. I am a garden. I will always grow again. I don't know what the future holds with Daniel. Maybe one day he will see the truth fully. Maybe one day he will sit at my table, eat from my harvest, and finally say, "Mom, I was wrong." Or maybe he never will. But I no longer wait for it. I already have what I need. I have my garden. I have the respect of neighbors, the gratitude of friends, the quiet bond with Claire that grows like a fragile vine. And most of all, I have myself, a self I thought I lost. After Richard died, a self I nearly let Daniel bury in shame, but one that rose again, stronger, deeper rooted. This is my harvest, not just the cucumbers or tomatoes or beans. The real harvest is dignity. The real harvest is knowing I cannot be erased. And as I sit here watching the sun set over rows of plants preparing to sleep, I think of every woman who has ever felt invisible in her own home, discarded by the very people she gave her life to. To them I say, you are not worthless, you are not shameful, you are not invisible, you are a garden. And no matter how many times they try to throw you away, you will keep growing. So, to all who have listened to my story, tell me, have you ever felt discarded, unseen, made to believe your efforts were nothing? What did you do? Did you forgive? Or did you reclaim yourself in silence? Share your story with me. Share it so others know they are not alone. And if you haven't already subscribed to Grace's Truth, because here we speak the truths others try to throw away. The garden rests now, but it will bloom again. And so will I. Always.